Morning. Okay, so today's daf is daf lamed vav, and on daf lamed hamed beis, the Gemara was vacillating back and forth whether the Kohanim are our shluchim, and the Kohen brings my carbon, he does the avodah on my behalf, if I'm the bala carbon, or shluchei derachmaninu, they are shluchim of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the nafkamina would be in mudar hana. Can the Kohen who is madir hana on the bala carbon bring the carbon on behalf of the bailim who's the mudar hana, because if he's a shliach then he's being mahana him. Masiv Rav Shimi bar Abba. Rav Shimi is asking on that side that argues that Kohanim are shluchei didan, and Rav Shimi is going to try to prove that on the contrary, Kohanim are shluchei derachmana. The Brisa states, if the Madir was a Kohen, Yizrok Olav Dam Chatoso V'Dam Hashomo. The Gemara is assuming now, at this point, that Chatos V'Yashom are regular Chatos V'Yashomos, has nothing to do with Mechusar Kapara of the case of Mitzorah. And the Kohen is allowed to be Zorik the Dam of Chatos and Asham. If Kohenim are Shluchei Didan, and the Kohen here is the Madir, how could he be Zorik the Dam on behalf of the Mudar Hana? He's giving him Hana. And the Gemara answers, Dam Chatoso Shel Mitzorah v'Dam Hashomo Shel Mitzorah. We're not talking about a regular classic Chatos or Osham, we're talking about a Mechusar Kapara Mitzorah. And as we said yesterday, there are four categories of Mechusar Kapara. There's Zav, Zova, Yoledis, and Mitzorah. And in the case of a Mechusar Kapara, since the carbon is not coming for Chet, but rather for Tahara, in order to allow the Tameh to purify himself or herself to enter into the Beis HaMikdash Kodshim, and therefore there is no shlichus. Even if I would maintain that Kohanim are indeed shluchei didan, not in the cases of Mechusar Kapara, because there you don't need the das of the Bala carbon of the Mechusar Kapara for the carbon. The carbon can be brought without his das or her das, and therefore there's no shlichus. Shlichus is only meaningful when there's das. So certainly in the cases of Mechusar Kapara, it's clear beyond the shadow of a doubt that shluchei derachmaninu, and therefore there's no isur of madir hana. And where do we see in the Torah that a mitzorah is a Mechusar Kapara until he brings his chatos v'yasham? The pasuk says, "Vayikra Yudal Zos Tia Toras HaMitzorah," and we're going to derive from the word Toras bein gadol bein katan. This is one of the rare occasions that a katan has to bring a carbon. We have it by Shifcha Charufa. And if the katan is Mechusar Kapara because he's a Mitzorah, then the carbon has to be brought. Now, if the carbon is brought for the Mitzorah who's a katan, is a lav bar das. So therefore, it's impossible to assume that the Kohen, when he brings the chatos or the asham of a Mitzorah katan on behalf of the katan, that he is his shliach, because there's no chiyuv of that, there's no das bailim over here. In the case of a katan, he's a lav bar das. So in this case, and all the cases of Mechusar Kapara, where we don't need to be makriv the carbon das bailim, the Kohen is certainly not serving as the shliach of the bailim, because there's no such thing as shlichus without das. Tonight we learned in the Mishnah in Gittin Mem Dalet of Beis HaKohanim Shepiglu B'Migdash. If the Kohen was mafagel a carbon and he had a machshava during one of the avodas of Chutz L'Zman and Chutz L'Komo, he passes the carbon with that machshava, and therefore Mezidim, if he did it deliberately, and he passes the carbon through his machshava mafageles, then Chayav, he has to pay compensation to the bailim for the value of that carbon, because as a result of this pigul, the bailim are going to have to replace the carbon and bring another one instead. And that's called a mazik momon bailim, and he has to pay tashlume Nizikin. Now the question is, would this apply to a carbon nedava? And l'chora, that would depend upon whether he said harei alai or harei zu. In the case of a neder of harei alai, then the carbon would have to be replaced by another carbon, and therefore the kohen, if he was mazid, he would have to pay. In a case of a nedava of harei zu, then the bailim l'chora don't lose anything because they don't have to replace the carbon. Or shall we say no? The fact that they lost this carbon, that itself is enough to be mechayev tashlumei nezikin. Now the Mishnah in Masechet Gittin continues and says, well, actually, it doesn't say the Beferish, but the Gemara is medayik by meticulously reading Chayovim in the case of Menzidim, that Hashogig in the Mishnah is implying that had the Kohen been a Shogig, he'd be potter. He doesn't have to pay Tashlumin, compensation for the Dmei Karban. And the Gemara in Gittin actually records a machlokas Amoraim between Chizkiah and other Amoraim, Rabbi Yochanan amongst them, as to whether or not this is a derabbanan, this p'tur. According to Chizkiah, Minat Torah, whether or not the Kohen was a Shogig or a Mezid in both cases, since Chizkiah maintains that Hezek Shein and Nikar Shmei Hezek, the Kohen would have to pay even in case of Shogig, and that comes under the category of Adam Muad Liolam, Bein B'Mezid, Bein B'Shogig. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, exempted the Kohen from payment in this case because they were afraid that if the Kohen is going to be chayiv to pay the bailim, maybe the Kohen would keep it a secret on the lip that it was a pigul. He was mefagel a korban. Rabbi Yochanan holds that hezek shein and nikar lav shmei hezek, and even in the case of mezid on a doraisa level, the Kohen would not have to pay damages. And by the way, the connection between Hezek Shein or Nikar and Grama ben Nezikin is very, very close. There's like a very slight difference, because almost by definition, every case of Hezek Shein and Nikar is Grama ben Nezikin. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, the fact that in the case of Mezid, the Kohen has to pay compensation, that itself is a takona dirabonon. So that people should not go ahead and think, well, you know what, I could create an Easter, I could be metame something of my friends, and so forth and so on. Ella, however, shepigulam pigul, whether or not the Kohen had a machshavas pigul, b'mezid or b'shogig, in both cases, his machshava hamifageles will passel the carbon. So therefore, the difference between shogeg and mezid in the case of a Kohen who was mefagel is only relevant to tashlumin and to compensation for being mazik his friend's carbon, but it has no bearing on the status of the carbon in both cases. Even though in the case of shogeg, we said he doesn't have to pay tashlum, but nevertheless, he's mefagel the carbon, and the carbon becomes possible. Gemara says the following. Let's just anticipate what's around the bend. We have halach and shlichus called shinui. If the shliach deviates from his mission or his commission, then he's no longer a shliach, and his shlichus is invalid. The Gemara has even a case where a man appoints a shliach to give the get up in the aliyah, in the attic, and the shliach gave the get on the bottom floor, and the shlichus is batel. So that's called shinui. Now, certainly in the case of a Kohen who was mefagel, if we assume that he's a shliach of the bailim, then why should the carbon be pigul? His status as a shliach is batel umevutal because He wasn't sent to be mafagel. That wasn't the purview of his shlichus, and therefore it's a shini in shlichus. Why should the korban be mafagel? If we're going to assume that the Kohen is the shliach not of the Bailim, but rather of Shomayim, Hainu Shepigu and Pigul, then we can understand why the Machshavas HaKohen is meaningful in a negative way, and it generates a psul in the carbon. So the Kohen is not the Bailim on the carbon, but nevertheless he can pass the carbon with his Machshavah because the Torah made him a shliach l'chol davar, even for a Machshavah Mefageles. Why should the Machshavas HaKohen, who's a shliach of the Bailim, be mefagel the carbon pigulam pigul? Lemole shlicha shavisech l'sakune l'takune v'lo lavuse. This is the famous principle in shlichus that the mishalech could say, I declare that the shliach was only sent to do X, and that for me is a tikkun. It's something positive. I didn't send him to do Y and deviate and therefore destroy the object or distort the object and passel it. So why is the carbon hustle as pigul? Why is the Kohen HaMakriv considered a shliach such that his machshava would passel the carbon? The Gemara answers, Amri, even if I tell you that the Kohen is a shliach of the Bailim, and under the normal general halachas of shlichus, the Bailim have a right to say, I didn't send you as the shliach, you are not operating as my shliach, and therefore your machshav will not passel the carbon. Shiny gabi pigul, we have exeris akasu. In the case of pigul, yalfusa, the omar krolo yichashiv lo, and then it says pigul yir. So the Torah in Vayikra Zion tells me lo yichashiv lo, and it's a pigul, bikol makom, to teach us that whenever the Kohen has a machshavas pigul, it passes the carbon, even though the carbon and the machshavas pigul is not the bailim of the carbon. The Kohen is not the bailim; he's not operating in the positive sense on behalf of the bala carbon. But nevertheless, the Torah was machadish here in this case that the machshava passes the carbon, and in that sense, you could still maintain that the Kohen is the shliach didan without asking a kash from pigul, because pigul is the exception. Kufa Rabbi Yochanan on Daf Lamed Hey, we had a statement of Rabbi Yochanan called Tzrichim Das Chutz Mechus Kapara. Every carbon has to be brought midaitam shalabailim, except for Mechus Kapara. We can be makabit without the Das Bailim, because it's not coming as a kapara on a chet. It's coming as a metayr and a matir to allow him to go into the migdash. Shrei Adam may be carbon al banav al benosav aktanim. And Rabbi Yochanan brings a proof from the fact that even if his child is a labardas, he's a katan, nevertheless he can bring the carbon on behalf of his children. And that proves that you don't need das bailim in the cases of mechusrei kapara. You could be makriv them without das bailim. Now we can see that there's a methodology here of Rabbi Yochanan, which is called the Alfinon Efshar Mi'i Efshar. And that's what the Gemara is about to analyze. In other words, we can derive the conclusion that you don't need das bailim in the case of karbanos of mukusa kapara from the case of a father who's bringing a carbon for the child. Now, in the case of the ketanim, that's called the efshar. There wasn't even a possibility of bringing the carbon with das bailim because the bailim, the katan is a labar das. So maybe the Torah allowed bringing a carbon without das bailim in the case where it's impossible and it's the efshar. There's no other option. But in the case of a mechusa kapara gadol, where there is an option of das bailim, maybe the Torah would require das bailim. The Torah very often will drop a requirement and a condition when that condition cannot be fulfilled. Like, for example, we have in Masechet Ksubos that ger katan ma'bilin osol das bezdin. Where's the das bailim in a case of a ger katan? He was born today, and you be megayer him. But the answer is, when it's impossible to get the das of the megayer, then it's gerus even without the condition of das. Here too, in the case of a katan, and the father wants to bring a carbon on his behalf, there's no possibility of das bailim, and therefore it's yefshar. How do you derive conclusions in the case of a mechusa kapar gadol, where there is a possibility of das bailim, that you waive the requirement of das bailim? Elameata, says the Gemara, according to your logic, meaning your methodology, Rabbi Yochanan, that Yalfinon Efshar mi Efshar is Yavi Adam Chatas Chelev al Chavero Shekain Adam maybe al Ishto Shota. Here Rabbi Yehuda. Allah Rabbi Lazar Hifresh Chatas Chelev al Chavero Lo Asa Klum. A person should be able to bring a chatas chelev. Chatas chelev means that Ploni ate chelev, b'shogeg. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, if Yalfinan efshar mi'i efshar, then just like a person who's married to a woman who's never chashota, he's able to bring the carbon on behalf of his wife without das bailim, so too, you should be able to bring any carbon on behalf of someone else who's chayiv in the carbon without das bailim. Are you dropping the whole requirement of das bailim in carbonos? Alama Rabbi Lazar says that if you were mafresh a carbon chatos on behalf of your friend without his knowledge, it's meaningless. And the Gemara answers, in truth, we never found that there's havas chatos chelev in a case of the efshar. We thought that a bailim, a husband, can bring a carbon chatos on behalf of his wife, who's a shota. That's not so. And I'll tell you why. And now the Gemara is going to apply the methodology of Bimon Efshar. Isha shota. You want to tell me that a husband will bring a chatas chelev on behalf of his wife, who's a shota? No matter how you slice the cake, whatever scenario you'll come up with, it's impossible. Why? If she ate the chelev when she was a shota, then there are no chiyuvim and no punishments for the action of a shota without das. You now have no choice but to assume the ochlok shipikachas, that when did she eat the chelev? When she was sane, when she was working with a full deck. And then afterwards, the nishtates. She became obligated in a carbon chatas chelev, and then she became a shota. And now you're going to tell me that the husband has to bring a chatas on behalf of his wife? Amar Rav Yirmi, Amar Rav Abo, Amar Rav Yochanan, Achal chelev hifresh carbon nishtate, chazav nishtate, pasul hold the nidche. We have a loch of dichui in carbonos. So a person was mafresh a carbon when he was shafui b'daita, when he was a pikeach, and then he became a shota. At that very moment, the carbon becomes possible, even though he was chazav v'nishtap, and now he went back to being sane. And that's called dichui. It means that at one point in the life of this carbon, the carbon was dachui, it was excluded from the mizbeach because the bailim of the carbon was a shota. And that's called hol v'nitchi dochet. It's always excluded. So if a person became a shota, then he's basically potter from any chiyuv chatas. Right? Even though he became chayiv in the chatas at one point before he became a shota, but now that he becomes a shota, the korban is nidche. So even though he was mafresh a korban chatos, while he was a pikeach for the chaylev that he ate, the korban is nidche liolam. And therefore, if a woman becomes a shota, the Baal has no chiyuv to bring a chatos on behalf of his wife. And the reason for that is because that korban was nidche the moment she became a shota. Rabbi Yehuda made a statement that other mechuyev b'korbanos ishto shota. That's only in a case of a chusa kapara, which doesn't require das ma'ila. So that if she was a zava or a mitzoras, I guess you'd say, or a yoledes, and then she became a shota, then the obligation to bring the korban remains firmly rooted as it was, because in these cases of chusa kapara, we don't need das ma'ila. So now we can answer the kasha that we raised, the objection against Rabbi Yochanan. Why shouldn't a person be makriv a korban chatas chaylev on behalf of his friend, just like he's makriv on behalf of his wife who's a shota? And the answer is that in truth, we never found a scenario in which a Baal would be chayiv to bring a korban chatas chaylev for his wife who's a shota, except for mechusa kapara, but that's a whole different story. Not a chatas chaylev. The Gemara again comes back to object to Rabbi Yochanan's methodology of danin efshar mi'i efshar le'me'ata. If you're validating a yalfus of efshar mi'i efshar, yavi adam pesach al chavero. A person should be allowed to bring a korban pesach on behalf of his friend without his friend's das, because once again I have a case of the efshar sheken adam mevi korban pesach al bonav al benosav ketanim, even though they have no das. And in Pesachim Daf Samach Aleph, the Gemara darshans that you need minui for the korban pesach before you shecht it. And a katan is not a bardah, so he can't create a minui on the korban. Nevertheless, there's a separate halacha that a father could bring a korban pesach for his son, and it's considered as if the son himself was manui. But again, once we have this breakthrough case where a father brings a korban pesach on behalf of his son without das, and again, that's the case of the efshar, because the cotton is not about das, then why don't we derive the conclusion, even in the case of the efshar, that you could bring a korban pesach on behalf of someone else? Alama Amar Rabbi Elazar, why does Rabbi Elazar say Hifresh Pesach al Chavero lo asa klum? That if a person was mafresh a korban pesach on behalf of his friend without his friend's das, then it's meaningless. Rabbi Zera celebrates of his lavdo raisa. The Gemara answers in the name of Rabbi Zera, and this is going to open up a whole new sugya in the Gemara, that this din that you can't bring a korban pesach on behalf of someone because that someone is not monui, he doesn't have das for minui. That halacha, which is derived from the pasuk Selebes Avos, is lav midoraisa. What does that mean, lav midoraisa? I mean, the Torah says Selebes Avos, which means that you need minui. But the answer is that requirement of minui applies to gedolim, but not to ketanim. As far as banav ubito hakatan or ketanim, lav midoraisa. The Torah didn't go as far as requiring minui in the case of your children who are ketanim. So they don't have at all a din of minui. So again, anyone who wants to eat from the korban pesach, he has to be nimna. He has to be min hamonui. But a person nevertheless can feed his children who are ketanim korban pesach, even though they're not nimnin on pesach, because Selebes Avos lavdo raisa in the case of a katan. So basically, you cannot derive anything from the fact that a father could be machil his son korban pesach, even though his son is a a katan is allowed bardas because the Torah allowed that to go on and didn't require minui. You have to find me a case where even though the Torah required minui, nevertheless you can bring it shalom idaito, and there is no such case. He writes here in the name of the Ran, in the note on the bottom, Kevan shadin sha'asa lechol pesach shalom l'nuya v'urak v'misha shayach limonos al ktanim shein lehem bas limonos al psachim. So the Torah went out of its way to allow a katan to eat from the korban pesach without minui and drop the requirement of minui. That can't prove anything about bringing a korban pesach on behalf of someone else. So again, in the case of a gadol who has a requirement of minui, it's impossible for anyone to bring a korban pesach on his behalf without minui. Now the Gemara says, I want to prove to you that a katan is not included in the din of minui with regard to korban pesach. Because of what we have in a Mishnah in Psachim Daf Peites, ha'omer lebanav, a person tells his children when they're going on Aliyah to Yerushalayim to shech the korban pesach, Areini shoket as a pesach al misha yala mikem rishon Yerushalayim. The father wants to be mizaris his children and give them a race, a competition, so that they'll be moved and inspired and motivated to come to Yerushalayim and Aliyah L'Regel. And the Mishnah says that following the proclamation of the father, Kevet shehichnis rishon rosho berubo, as soon as one of his children enters into Yerushalayim, which means Rosho Berubo are past the gates of Yerushalayim, inside Yerushalayim, Zocha Bechelko, he becomes the winner of the prize, and he has his chelik in the korban pesach, umizakes echad imo, and he can now operate mitam zechia on behalf of his brothers. Now the Gemara thinks at this point that the Mishnah is talking about bonim ketanim, and even though they need to be money on the korban, and that's why the father said, "Get there to Yerushalayim, so you'll be manui." And even if they get there after they already shechted the sev, the korban, and the Gemara says, if you're going to tell me sell a base avos doraisa, and therefore, even with regard to bonim ketanim, there would be a requirement of minui, then al bisra koyu mizakilahu. How is it possible that the father is after the situation of shechita, is after the shechita, the meat of the korban pesach is munach lefanav, he's going to be zaka them a chelik in the meat of the korban, when we have a Mishnah in Psachim deriving from the pasuk mibayis habayis miyoseh, that you cannot become a money on a korban pesach after the shechita. So it must mean that with regard to bonim ketanim, the Torah never required minui, because it's impossible to have minui after shechita. Ella, says the Gemara, if that's correct and a katan doesn't require minui on the sell, lama lahu di'amalu on food, so why did the father say that he who gets there first and is Ola Yerushalayim first, he will become part of the korban pesach, meaning that he will be manui? Apparently there is a chiyuv minui. And the answer says, no, that's not what the father had in mind. Kidei l'zarzam the mitzvahs. He wanted to be mizaris them in the mitzvah aliyah l'regel, but not because they had to become money on the korban pesach. Tanya nami hachi ma'isa hoya v'kodmu abonim bonos l'bonim nimtzu abonos zrizos v'abonim shpolim. So the Brisa doesn't say that the bonos were zocha and the bonim were not zocha. It means that we're not talking about the zechia at all here. We're talking about the zrizus of being memayer with alacrity to come quickly on Aliyah to Yerushalayim. And the Bonim are called Shfolim because they came late. And now we're up to the part of the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Hey that a person who is Madir, his friend, is Torem es Trumosov es Masrosov L'daito. If he has the go-ahead, the green light from the Baal HaTvuah, who is the Mudar, then he's allowed to be Mafresh Truma Meiser on behalf of the Mudar. And there's no violation of Mudar Hano.